There are many steps that go into creating a good quality HDR image. Perhaps the most important is the exposure settings when you capture the file. For this tutorial, we're going to talk about how to set the exposure properly and make sure that you capture the entire dynamic range of the scene. This is the final result, but let's go back to what I saw when I took the picture. This is the first photograph. This is a screen capture taken off of the LCD display on the camera. So you can see they have very dark shadows and bright highlights. Now if I change the camera's display mode into the histogram mode, the same image will look like this. You can see I've taken this photograph in aperture priority. It's always important to take the photographs in aperture priority or in manual mode, always keeping a constant aperture. If you adjust the aperture in a sequence, you'll also affect the depth of field between the files, and that can introduce some unwanted artifacts in the image. Always very important to keep the aperture constant. So if I look at this image and I look at the histogram more importantly, I can see I've blown out the highlights here and I've got very dark shadows here. Obviously the dynamic range of this scene was too much for the camera to take in one shot. That's why we're using HDR techniques. So in the Nikon D300, I can set the camera to shoot a bracketed sequence, and I can set different number of images to be captured in the sequence. For this particular example, I set the camera to expose 9 different exposures at one-stop increments. So going now to the darkest exposure at -4 EV, I have this image. Now you can see by the histogram that almost everything is blocked up in the shadows, and the highlights are now moved down to almost the 1/3 down from where they normally would be. As I increase the exposure again by a stop, you can see I'm starting to open up a little more here in this field, but I still have the histogram starting well at about 1/4 of my about a fifth of the way in. This is still probably too dark to be useful. Going now to my next exposure, you'll see that I'm starting to get close to the edge of my histogram, meaning I'm maintaining all of the information that are in the highlights. Obviously the shadows are still plugged up, and you can see that very clearly here on the left hand side of the histogram. Going to my next exposure, you can see I'm starting to expose for the midtones. I'm starting to blow out my highlights, and my shadows are still blocked up. As I go to my next exposure, more highlights are blown out, but I'm starting to open up the shadow detail. And this is an image that would provide good information for the HDR merge in the quarter tones and the shadows. Going to my next shot, you can see that I'm really starting to open up the shadows, and my histogram is shifting up forward. Here I can see by the histogram that I have no more shadow information. So this is probably the last image out of the sequence that I really need to have in order to maintain the shadow information that is up here in the rafters and in the back of the scene. To complete the series, you can see that I'm going even brighter. Now just because I captured 9 exposures doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to use them all to create my HDR file. There are many reasons for using fewer photos than 9 to create an HDR merge, especially for a scene like this. But it does make sense to capture all the information while you're on location at the scene, so that you can choose later on which images will make the best HDR results. If you have an image in the series where there's some motion, perhaps there's a person that walks through the frame, knowing that you have a bracket above and below that you could use instead of that particular image is always helpful in the end when you're doing your post-processing. So capture all you can up front and decide which files you're going to use in the end. If you have a camera that doesn't support automatic bracketing and 9 exposure increments, or 7 exposure or 5 exposure increments, you can also do this manually. In this case, I've switched my display to show me the highlight warning on the image. So this black area here normally blinks and would show me that I've blown out the highlight information here. So what I want to do is adjust my exposure so that I get to a point where I'm maintaining all of my highlight information. This is called exposing for the highlights. Once I've reached that point, I'll then manually step down, always decreasing the shutter speed by a half in order to give me a one-stop increment. So let's look at this one. Obviously the highlights are blown out here. If I go to this next exposure, you can see that I've reduced the amount of highlight information that I've lost, but I still haven't captured it all. Finally, this image captures all of my highlight information. So this would be the starting point, and from here I would create multiple exposure brackets manually by adjusting the shutter speed. So that's how we would manage the exposures for this type of scene with different kinds of cameras. Thank you for watching.